Hello, I'm Jean Meyn, and welcome to In the Know Women Show, where women share the stories of their lives and inspire us all. Today, our guest is Billie Mazzei, storyteller extraordinaire. Welcome, Billie.
Thank you, Jean.
Okay. I wonder if you would tell me what you think a storyteller is. How would you describe that? It could be yourself, or it could be just a storyteller in general.
A storyteller has a story, or knows a story, or sees a story, or feels a story. They come in all different ways and wants to share it, and almost can't help sharing it. So I have found that I think in stories. Whatever's going on, it's like, oh, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, and there's a story. And sometimes I want to share it. Sometimes I don't know if people want to hear it, but I want to share it. So I think all storytellers are a little odd, but they're all fun, and all storytellers find different stories and tell different stories. When I first started intentionally telling stories, I asked the young man who was my teacher, how do you find a story? And he just smiled and said, you don't find a story finds you. And that's really true. It lands somewhere in your body, and it's like, oh, I want to share that. I want to share that. For me, it either tickles my funny bone, or makes me curious, or it makes me sad, or it's just a good story.
Mm-hmm. And I understand that you've been involved for a long time with South Sound Story Guild, mm-hmm. which is a local group. Mm-hmm. Would you tell us about that?
Sure. We started, must have been in the 1980s. And just people coming together, sharing stories. And for a while we met at the old Carnegie Library. Mm. And we told stories there. Sometimes we had other people as guests, and mostly it was just this small group. And that kind of morphed into the Storytelling Guild with the passion for oral storytelling and the passing on of stories. The oral tradition is different than a reading. You don't get to have a script. My husband used to say he wanted to tell stories, but he seemed to have a hard time. And I said, well, just describe the picture you have in your head. He said, I don't have any pictures in my head. He said, you mean it's like you have a movie camera in your head? I said, kind of. He said, well, I don't. So his was more the approach of reading a story and then connecting with something in that story that he liked and then telling it. And he actually got pretty good. For a while we worked together as tellers too.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of, how would someone get involved with the Storytelling Guild?
Show up. We are in kind of the place that everybody is right now with COVID. We're meeting online on the, second Wednesday of every month?
Well, the next one is December 8th.
Okay.
And we're showing a slide right now
to
give people the information about that and contact.
Great.
And what are the benefits of participating in
Well, first of all, you get to meet a great group of people.
Like you.
Who are fun and a little, I think we're all a little quirky, but they're good quirks. There's a camaraderie in storytelling where it's not often, at least in the Guild, it's not competitive at all. It's a place where people can come and feel safe and try out a story, get feedback if they want it, it's not necessary, but you can start something. Maybe you're working on a new story and you want feedback. Say, well, where did you get lost in the story? Or what didn't make sense? Or, whatever. And people give feedback very carefully and gently and positively.
Okay.
So it's a safe place.
And what about Telebration?
Telebration is an international event that happens every year around Thanksgiving. So sometimes ours is the day after Thanksgiving this year, and that's often when the Olympia Guild does it. But it happens all over the world, and it's a night all over the world where people get together and share stories.
Well, I've been before when it was at Traditions. I mean, I know it'll be on Zoom again, but it was great fun, and there were different types of stories.
Yes. There's some people that almost always tell personal stories. Some people almost always tell fairy tales, or we have one member who is a Bear Rabbit fan. She tells the best Bear Rabbit stories and trickster tales. Some people will tell, fairy tales, Bible stories, you name it, whatever story wants to be told.
Okay. And there's also another local storytelling group.
Story Slam,
Storyoli,
which is a story slam, which has its roots in something called the Moth, that started in the South with people sitting on porches telling stories. And it's, again, all over the world now. And there are rules to Storyoli. It needs to be a personal story. It needs to be less than 8 minutes or less. And it's your story. You don't tell anybody else's story. Mm-hmm. And it is judged. So there are judges in the audience, and you're judged on a score of 1 to 10 by 3 different people. And the one who gets the highest score that night goes on to a grand slam at the end of the season or the beginning of the next season.
And it's exciting that they're back. They found a
yes,
and we have some information up on the screen that was
Good.
up earlier. And it's back.
We're back.
That they're back doing live. The
Yeah.
online didn't work so well. I mean,
online, there's something about the connection between the teller and the audience that you don't quite get online. It's just different. In person, live, there's magic. Mm-hmm. Online, it's a story.
Well, we do have a small audience here in the studio with the crew. I wonder if you would give us an example of a story.
You asked me that when we were prepping, and I thought, most of my stories are too long. Where are we with time?
Well, I think you could do a Story Slam story, actually, if you'd like.
Okay. This is, I grew up with storytellers in my family. So I will tell this story in honor of my grandfather, who was a great storyteller. And you all can help me tell this story, and I'll tell you when. My granddad, when he was a young man, had a girlfriend. Her name was Nellie, and she lived on a property next to his, but it wasn't like we're neighbors where, the houses are close together. Granddad lived over here on a big piece of property, and between his house and where Nellie lived, there was a great field and a creek, and then another great field, and then Nellie's house. Well, to get to Nellie's house, there were 2 ways. You could walk across the creek, or you could walk 2.5 miles down the road to a bridge. Well, Granddad never wanted to do that. So the only problem with that was that the creek wasn't always predictable. Sometimes it was very low and you could walk across it easily. And other times in the spring and in the winter, well, it was pretty full. But Granddad had a trick. He would go down to the edge of the creek and he'd stand there and he'd call out, "How deep's the creek? How deep's the creek?" And all the little frogs would say, "Ankle deep, ankle deep." Can you say it with me?
Ankle deep.
Ankle deep, ankle deep. Well, he'd take off his shoes, tie them around his neck, roll up his pants, and he'd start off onto the creek. Well, he'd go out a little further and it was a little deeper and he'd call out again, "How deep's the creek? How deep's the creek? How deep's the creek?"
Ankle deep.
No, it's knee deep, knee deep, knee deep. So he'd roll up his pants a little further, up a little further, and off he'd go. And he was gauging how much further it was. He still had a ways to go, but he kept going and he really wanted to see his Nellie girl. So he walked out and it got deeper and deeper. And he called out again. He was more than halfway there. So he called out again, "How deep's the creek? How deep's the creek? How deep's the creek?" Belly deep, belly deep, belly deep.
Belly deep.
Well, by this time he was really wet all the way up to his waist, and he thought, well, I'll just go a little further and see how it goes. So he walked out and he one more time called, "How deep's the creek? How deep's the creek? How deep's the creek?" Say it with me. How deep's the creek? Great old Granddaddy Frog called back, "Better go round, better go round, better go round." And he did. You don't, as a storyteller, you're very careful, or you should be really careful, about telling other people's stories without their permission. So there are stories that I've told over the years that I've heard other people tell, and especially if it's a recorded one, always ask permission. And usually storytellers are very gracious and they will say, "Absolutely, tell the story, but please don't make money on it." Mm-hmm. And give me the credit.
And then are there some cautions or concerns about different cultures and their stories?
Absolutely, absolutely. Telling stories from another culture is a tricky thing because they don't belong to you. They belong to that particular culture. So if you do your research and if you know the culture, or at least can find out about the culture, then you're probably okay.
And is this a particular time in the world, in our society, where we need stories?
What do you think?
I think the answer is yes, but I'd like to hear you say why. How's that?
Yeah, I think stories are more important now maybe than they've ever been. They ground us, they give us hope, they make us laugh, they help us get in touch with our emotions. They bind us together in a particular way. And I read one time in the Reader's Digest many, many years ago, a little anecdote about by Jack Benny, who was a great comedian, and he said, "I don't know why people, when you start a story, you say, 'Stop me if you've heard this.'" He said, "Do you ever do that with an orchestra?" You know, a good story is a good story, and it can be told. And an oral story never comes out the same twice. There's always a little bit of a difference. Storytellers don't memorize stories. What happens when you memorize a story is you forget something. And then it's like, oh man, that was an important thing. I didn't say that, and it's not going to work if people don't know that. An old librarian told me one time, she said, if you do that, this is what you do. She said, you get to this part of the story where you realize you've forgotten, and you don't go, oh no, I forgot something. You say, oh, did I tell you? And people are pulled right back into the story, get the piece of story that you left out, and you go on.
You know, I just remembered that at least one of the times I heard you tell a story, it's the story Oli, that you had done that. You've done that. I remember hearing you say that. Did I tell you?
Yeah.
Now I know. Now I know.
It's a trick.
That's a great.
You know that I just forgot something, but it is, and you know, when people, especially if your story is not one that has really engaged people, you know, I mean, you get to start thinking about something else. But when somebody says, "Did I tell you?" right away, you're trying to remember. Did she didn't? Oh, okay. So I'm listening again.
So, how would you say that? I think you've already touched on this by some of what you've been talking about yourself, but how have you woven stories into your life?
Have to ask my children and grandchildren. Here she goes again. That's a hard question because I don't think about that. It's like I just do it.
Well, let me ask it a different way then. When did you tell your first story?
Oh my. When did I tell my first story? I was telling stories almost as soon as I could talk. But I'll tell you one little thing that, you know, you'd think I have a bunch of grandkids and great-grandkids, and you'd think with all of those, I'd be telling stories all the time. I don't. I do, but I don't. That doesn't make sense. One time, one of my grandsons, when he was about 9, said, "Grandma, read me a story from your head." And so that's kind of, and because they're not all close geographically, I will often record stories and send them to the kids. And I've heard back, you know, they listen to them in the car and they listen to them. I put them to sleep. And I have one who is not a reader. And so what I do with him is that I send him a story that I've gotten the book for, and I send him the book and the recording, thinking, you know, maybe it'll click, because he's just not interested in reading. And that to me is such a loss. I can't imagine not reading.
Well, storytelling would be really important, the oral tradition for
Yeah.
someone who's not reading.
Yeah.
I mean, tribes have kept their laws orally,
Yes.
you know, and not
Yes.
written them down and
Yes.
passed on
Yes.
traditions. So,
Yes.
do you think that being a woman influences your stories and your storytelling?
I suppose influences about everything. I think that a lot of in the traditional storytelling, it often is either the old woman or the old man who tell the tribal stories, they're the keeper of the stories. So sharing those, and I think just family stories. We've got 2 holidays coming up or more than 2, but 2 primarily where people will be together, and that's when the stories. I heard my father at age 81 at the end of a Thanksgiving dinner say to the whole 20, however many of us there were, say, you know, when I was 10 years old, I burned my dad's barn down. I had never heard that. And he went on to tell that story, and it was a very instructional kind of, I mean, the kids were like, I was too, hearing him tell that story that I had never heard. So it's what makes family connections, what makes people connections.
And there's a particular story, I think you said you were okay about talking about this, about when your husband died, that I think you described has become a family legacy story.
Yeah, it has.
Do you mind telling that?
My husband died 21 years ago. He had prostate cancer, and the death was long, and it was hard. And he was a man who grew up in an Italian immigrant family during the Depression. So he experienced, and he was the baby, so there was a lot of, he never felt like he had enough or that he could do enough. But on his deathbed, the day he died, he said 3 things. He looked at me and he said, "You're the best," which was lovely. And then he said, "I'm going to get my award." And I thought, well, that's strange. We'd been reading, he liked me to read scripture to him every morning. And that morning we had read from one of the letters of Paul. And Paul said, "I have run the race and I await my," I had always read it, "award," but in this translation it said, "I await my reward." I thought, wow. And then he looked at me and he said, with just this great awe and surprise and gratitude, "I've always had everything I needed." And it's like, oh, I'm sorry that he didn't know that sooner, but it has become a family motto, and my kids and my grandkids say it to one another and say it to me. Don't forget what Grandpa said. We'll always have everything we need. Mm-hmm. It's a great end and beginning.
Mm-hmm. So still on, that's very touching, and I'm glad that your family has that.
Yeah,
that
we are too.
He left that gift among others,
Yes.
I'm sure. So very briefly, I wonder if you would talk about the prodigal mother stories, how you've put stories into book form.
Yeah, well, I've done that with a couple of books. One, The Prodigal Mother, is a short little book. It only has 5 stories in it. And I took the stories that I've known for years, they're Bible stories, and they're ones you've heard, I'm sure. But I looked at the story and either there was something or someone missing, or there was kind of a Paul Harvey, the rest of the story. So there's the story of the prodigal mother. When I read that story, it's like, well, there's a dad and 2 boys. So what was the mom doing? What was her part in this story? So I imagined that and wrote it down. The new one is called Fat, Faithful, and Fairly Flirty. Stories from my life. And I have struggled with all 3 of those things. Several years ago, I weighed 350 pounds. I don't weigh that now. You don't need to know what I weigh, but it's a lot less than that. I was born and raised a Roman Catholic and practiced that faith for many, many years. Am part of a community that's led by a Roman Catholic woman priest. And that was a big, big adventure. And I just like to flirt. I mean, it's just, and I do.
So you have a few seconds left to just impart whatever you would like to folks?
Oh, I would say tell your stories. Tell them to one another. Tell them to yourself if nobody will listen.
That's a great way to end our show. Thank you for joining us on In the Know Women's Show. And I want to remind you about the events that Billie talked about today. The South Sound Story Guild with their story swaps beginning again on Zoom, though, on December 8th and continuing. And you can make note of the contacts and also go to their website. Also, their celebration called Telebration on November 6th, the day after Thanksgiving at 6 p.m., which will be online. In addition, the other local story group around is Storyteller. They have what they call Story Slams, and they're back live beginning December 16th at 7 p.m. And they will be at the Cryptotropa Bar on 4th Avenue, where they require proof of vaccination as well as mask. Oh, and examples from Storyteller are on the website. So check those out. You can get great examples of Storyteller Story Slams. Again, thank you for joining us on In the Know Women's Show. Till next time.